There was a time when nobody asked what was for dinner, because dinner was whatever the house could give. No menus, no takeout, no drive-through glow at the end of the street. Just a stove, a few plain things, and someone who knew how to make them stretch. Beans and cornbread fed more families through hard winters than anything else on this list. A bag of dried pintos cost almost nothing, and one bag could carry a family for most of a week. The beans went into a pot early in the morning, sometimes with a scrap of salt pork if there was one, and they simmered all day while the house filled up with that low, steady smell. Cornbread came together in a cast iron skillet that never really got washed, just wiped out and set back on the stove. When supper came, everybody got a bowl of beans and a wedge of bread to sop with. Nobody called it poor food at the table. It was just supper, and it was hot, and there was enough. The pot of beans sat on the back of the stove between meals, and anyone hungry could go dip a bowl. On the last day, the beans went thick and dark, and everyone quietly agreed those were the best ones. Fried mush was what breakfast leftovers turned into by evening. Cornmeal boiled up thick in the morning, and whatever did not get eaten was poured into a loaf pan and left to set. By supper time it had firmed into something you could slice. Mothers cut it into slabs and fried it in bacon grease until the edges went crisp and golden, and the inside stayed soft and warm. Some families ate it with a little molasses dribbled over the top. Others ate it plain with salt. It cost pennies, it filled a stomach, and it taught children an early lesson that nothing in the kitchen was ever really finished. Food just changed shape until it was gone. The loaf pan lived on the counter half the week, waiting under a dish towel, and slicing into it felt like opening something saved on purpose. Milk toast was the supper for tired nights and tight weeks. A slice of bread, toasted on a rack over the burner or in the oven door, laid in a shallow bowl and covered with warm milk. A pat of butter if the butter dish had anything in it, a shake of sugar or a pinch of salt depending on the family. It sounds like almost nothing, and it was almost nothing, but it was warm and soft, and it settled a hungry child down for bed. Grandmothers made it for the sick, for the sad, and for the last night before payday. There was a gentleness in it. Somebody stood at the stove warming milk just for you, and that counted for a lot. Some folks called it graveyard stew and laughed about the name, but they still made it, week after week, year after year. Tomato gravy over biscuits showed up when the meat ran out, but the garden had not. A spoon of bacon grease, a spoon of flour stirred in a hot skillet until it browned. Then home-canned tomatoes went in, juice and all, and the whole thing bubbled into a thick red gravy. It got ladled over split biscuits, and that was the meal. Whole meal. Families in the South ate it for supper more often than they ever admitted later. The jars of tomatoes came from the summer's canning. Rows of them lined up in the cellar like money in the bank. Every jar opened in January was a small victory over the season, proof that the work done in August was still feeding people in the cold. Cabbage and noodles came over from the old countries and stayed because it was cheap and it worked. A head of cabbage cost next to nothing and went a long way. It got sliced thin and cooked down slow in butter or bacon fat until it turned sweet and soft and golden at the edges. Then it was tossed with wide egg noodles, sometimes homemade, rolled out on the kitchen table and cut with a knife. Salt, pepper, and a lot of it. In mill towns and mining towns, this was a Friday supper, a meatless supper, a payday is still 2 days away supper. The smell of cabbage cooking drifted through whole neighborhoods at once, because everybody on the block was making do the same way. Hoover stew got its name from hard feelings and a hard decade. During the worst years of the 1930s, families in shanty camps and crowded kitchens stretched a package of hot dogs into a meal for six. The hot dogs got sliced into thin coins so every bowl would have a few. They went into a pot with macaroni, canned tomatoes, and canned corn or beans, whatever the shelf held. It simmered until the macaroni swelled, and the broth turned pink and salty. People named it after the president they blamed for their empty pockets, and the name stuck. It was a meal built out of resentment and cleverness in equal parts, and children who ate it grew up and made it again, because by then it just tasted like home. The poor man's meal was fried potatoes and hot dogs in one skillet, and it fed millions. Potatoes got cubed small so they would cook fast and stretch far. They went into hot grease with a chopped onion, and once they browned, sliced hot dogs went in too. Everything cooked together until the edges crisped, and the kitchen smelled like something better than the grocery bill suggested. One skillet, one wooden spoon, supper on the table in 20 minutes. Mothers made it on the nights when the week had beaten them, and fathers coming in from second shift ate it standing up at the counter. It asked for nothing fancy and gave back something honest. To this day, people who grew up on it can smell it from memory. Cornbread and buttermilk was supper in a glass. On the hottest nights or the leanest ones, an old man would crumble a wedge of leftover cornbread into a tall glass, pour cold buttermilk over it, and eat it with a long spoon. That was the whole meal. Nothing cooked, nothing bought, nothing wasted. The cornbread soaked up the tangy milk and turned into something between bread and pudding. Grandfathers swore by it, sitting on the porch with the glass sweating in their hand while the day cooled off. It was the kind of supper that came from a world where milk came from your own cow and bread came from your own skillet. And a man could feed himself well on things that never saw a store. Egg gravy stretched 2 eggs into supper for 5. A little grease, a little flour, milk stirred in slow until it thickened, and then beaten eggs poured in ribbons while the fork kept moving. The eggs cooked into soft golden threads all through the white gravy. It went over bread, over biscuits, over yesterday's cornbread, over whatever the house had. Farm families made it when the hens slowed down in winter and every egg mattered. 2 eggs would not scramble into much on their own, but drowned in gravy, they covered every plate at the table. That was the whole trick of hard times cooking. You did not ask what you had. You asked how far it could go. Salmon patties came out of a can and turned into Friday supper across half the country. A single can of pink salmon, mashed up with a beaten egg, some crushed crackers or a handful of flour, an onion if you had one, shaped into little cakes and fried in a hot skillet until both sides went brown and crisp. That one small can made 6 or 8 patties, enough for everyone to have their share with a side of whatever the garden or the cellar offered. The can itself cost less than any fresh meat at the butcher's counter. Children fought over the crispy edges, and mothers quietly took the broken one that fell apart in the pan. That was how it always went. American goulash was the great stretcher of ground beef. 1 pound of hamburger, browned in the big pot with onions, then macaroni, canned tomatoes, and enough water to make it all go further. It simmered until the noodles drank up the tomato, and everything turned soft and red and filling. 1 pound of meat, and 8 people ate until they were done. Every family had their own version, and every family thought theirs was the right one. Some added a spoon of sugar, some a shake of chili powder, some nothing at all. It got made in the biggest pot the kitchen owned, and the leftovers tasted better the second night, which mattered, because there was always a second night. Creamed chipped beef on toast came home from army mess halls and factory lunch pails. Thin sheets of dried salted beef, torn into pieces and stirred into white gravy, then poured over toast. Soldiers gave it a rude nickname that everybody knew and nobody said in front of Grandma. But at home, it was a serious answer to a serious problem. Dried beef kept without an icebox, and a little went a long way. The salt in the meat seasoned the whole pan. The little glass jars the beef came in got washed out and kept, and they became the juice glasses on breakfast tables for the next 30 years. On a cold night, a plate of it with soft toast underneath was warm, heavy, and filling, and a working man could get through the evening on it. It was not fancy. It was fuel, and fuel was the point. Dandelion greens were the meal that grew in the yard for free. In early spring, before the flowers came, women and children went out with a paring knife and a paper sack and cut the young greens right out of the lawn, the ditch, the edge of the field. They got washed 3 times in the sink to shed the grit, then cooked down with bacon grease and a splash of vinegar. Bitter, yes, but the fat and the vinegar tamed it, and it was the first fresh green thing anyone had tasted since fall. There was pride in it, too. The yard was feeding the family, and it had not cost 1 cent. Old-timers said the bitterness cleaned your blood after a long winter. Maybe it did. It certainly cleaned the yard. Ham bone bean soup was the second life of Sunday's ham, and sometimes the third. When the meat was gone, the bone was just getting started. It went into the big pot with dried navy beans, an onion, and water, and it simmered half a day until the marrow and the little clinging scraps of meat gave everything they had to the broth. The house smelled rich, even though the pot held almost nothing you could have sold. 1 bone could flavor 2 full pots of soup before it finally gave out. Butchers used to give bones away, or sell them for pennies, and women who knew what they were doing never left the shop without one. Throwing away a ham bone was close to a sin. Hoe cakes were bread for people who had cornmeal, water, and not much else. The batter was simple as could be, meal and water and salt, sometimes a little grease. It got fried in small rounds on a hot skillet, or long ago, folks said, on the flat blade of a field hoe held over the fire, which is where the name came from. They came out crisp at the edges and steamy in the middle, and they took the place of bread at any meal that needed one. Field workers carried them cold in a pocket. Children ate them hot with sorghum syrup when there was any. A hoe cake asked for no oven, no yeast, no waiting. Just heat and hunger, and it answered both. Grandmothers judged the skillet by how the first one browned, and flicked water on the iron to hear it dance before the batter ever touched it. Fried bologna supper was the meat course for families who could not buy a roast. The butcher sliced bologna thick for a few cents, and at home it went into a dry hot skillet where it curled up like a little bowl and browned around the rim. Mothers cut slits in the edges to keep it flat, or let it curl and cracked an egg into the cup it made. It got served with beans or fried potatoes, or just between two slices of white bread with mustard. It sizzled and smelled like real cooking, and that mattered. A kid at that table did not feel poor. A kid at that table smelled meat frying and heard the radio, and felt like everything was more or less fine. Rice supper was the quiet meal at the end of the quiet weeks. A pot of white rice, cooked soft, served in bowls with warm milk poured over, and a spoon of sugar on top. Maybe a shake of cinnamon in the houses that had it. It looked like breakfast and nobody cared. Rice was one of the cheapest things in the store, and a small bag of it swelled into a meal that filled every bowl in the house. Mothers served it without apology on the nights when there was nothing else to serve, and children remember it now with a strange fondness. The warmth of it, the sweetness, the way the whole family ate the same soft, simple thing together, and nobody complained out loud. Hamburger gravy on bread carried factory towns through the middle of the century. A half-pound of ground beef, browned and broken up small. Then flour and milk stirred in to build a thick, pale gravy full of little bits of meat. It got spooned over slices of plain white bread laid flat on the plate, and the bread soaked it up like it was made for the job. Some folks called it SOS, same as the chipped beef. Some just called it gravy bread. Either way, it turned the smallest amount of meat the butcher would sell into a supper that sat heavy and good in the stomach. On payday, there might be mashed potatoes under it instead. You could measure the week by what was under the gravy. Potato cakes were what leftover mashed potatoes became, because mashed potatoes were never allowed to just be leftovers. The cold mash got mixed with an egg and a little flour, maybe some chopped onion, and shaped into flat rounds by hands that had done it 1,000 times. Into the bacon grease they went, until each side wore a brown crust, and the inside turned creamy and hot again. They showed up next to eggs in the morning or stood alone as supper at night. Children liked them better than the original potatoes, which mothers found a little insulting and a little convenient. Nothing was wasted, and something plain got a second chance to be wonderful. That was the whole philosophy of those kitchens in one small fried cake. Scrapple was thrift turned into an art form. When a hog was butchered, the parts that had no other place, the scraps and trimmings, got boiled down with cornmeal and spices into a thick gray mush, then poured into pans to set into firm loaves. Come supper time or morning, it got sliced and fried until the outside crackled. Pennsylvania Dutch families perfected it, and it spread anywhere people believed an animal should feed you from one end to the other. It sounds rough when you describe it plain, but fried right, with the crust dark and the inside soft, it was genuinely good. It tasted like sage and corn, and the deep old rule that you honor the animal by wasting none of it. Chicken and dumplings was how one bird fed a family of 8, sometimes twice. The hen went into the pot whole, often an old one past her laying years, because young chickens were worth more alive. She simmered for hours until the meat gave up and fell off the bone, and the water turned into rich golden broth. Then the meat got pulled and picked, every shred of it, and dropped back in. The dumplings were the real trick. Flour, a little fat, a splash of milk, rolled thin and cut into strips or dropped in soft spoonfuls, depending on where your people came from. They cooked right in the broth and swelled up until the pot was more dumpling than chicken, which was exactly the point. One chicken, 8 full plates, leftover broth for tomorrow, Women who could do that math in a pot were the reason families made it through. Macaroni and tomatoes was the two-ingredient supper of the whole rural South and half the Midwest besides. Elbow macaroni boiled soft, then a quart jar of home-canned tomatoes stirred in, juice and all, with butter or bacon grease and plenty of salt and pepper. Some families sprinkled sugar on top, and children stirred it in until the whole bowl went sweet and red. It cost almost nothing because the tomatoes came from the garden, and the macaroni came in a paper bag from the store for a few cents. It was soft enough for Grandma's teeth, and filling enough for a boy who had been in the field all day. People who ate it every week for years still crave it on cold nights, and no restaurant anywhere has it on the menu, which tells you something about who it was ever for. Pot liquor with cornmeal dumplings was proof that even the cooking water was food. When a mess of collard or turnip greens boiled all afternoon with a chunk of fatback, the greens were only half the meal. The dark green broth left in the pot liquor, held all the vitamins and all the smoky flavor, and no one dreamed of pouring it out. Cornmeal dumplings got patted together and dropped straight into that simmering liquor, where they cooked into tender little pillows soaked through with green and smoke. Families ate the greens first, then went back with spoons and cornbread for the liquor. Doctors later figured out that broth was full of exactly what poor diets were missing. Grandmothers already knew. They had known for 100 years. Onion sandwiches were supper at the absolute bottom of the week, and there was no dressing them up. 2 slices of bread, spread with butter or lard or a swipe of mayonnaise, and thick slices of raw onion in between with salt. That was it. Men carried them to work in paper sacks, and children ate them after school. And families ate them for supper on the nights when the cupboard had been honest with everyone. A big onion cost a penny or two and made you feel like you had eaten something with force to it. Sweet onions made it almost pleasant. Strong ones made it a test of character. Either way, people ate them, and some of them, decades later, would fix one on a quiet evening just to remember, and find that it still tasted like getting by. Liver and onions filled plates because liver was the meat nobody wanted, which made it the meat poor families could have. Butchers practically gave it away. At home it got soaked in milk to gentle the flavor, dredged in flour, and fried fast in a skillet already sweet with a pile of slow-cooked onions. Done right, it came out tender, covered in soft onions and pan gravy, and it was iron-rich in a way that mattered for mothers and growing children who did not see much other meat. Done wrong, it was shoe leather, and every family had one cook who did it right and one who should have been stopped. Children groaned about liver night. Grown men who had been hungry as boys ate every bite and wiped the plate with bread. Fried taters and onions was so common it barely counted as a recipe. It was more like a reflex. Potatoes sliced thin, onions sliced thinner, both dropped into a black skillet with bacon grease and left mostly alone, until the bottom layer crusted brown. Then a turn with the spatula and more waiting. The whole trick was patience and not too much stirring. It was supper by itself more nights than anyone kept track of, eaten with ketchup or with nothing, with cornbread or with light bread, at a table or off, a plate balanced on a knee by the radio. The skillet mattered as much as the food. It hung on a nail by the stove, black and heavy and older than the marriage, and it had fried potatoes for people who were gone now, and it would fry them for people not yet born. Succotash stretched 2 vegetables into one meal and came from wisdom far older than any hard decade. Corn and beans, grown together in the same fields by native people long before anyone else arrived, cooked together in the same pot ever since. In lean times it was made from what the garden or the cans could give, simmered with butter or a bit of pork, sometimes with milk stirred in to make it rich. The corn brought sweetness, and the beans brought the kind of solid fullness that got a person through the evening chores. Together they made something close to complete food, though nobody at the table would have used those words. They just knew that a bowl of it held you, and that the garden rows out back were doing the work a paycheck could not. Water gravy was what the kitchen made when even the milk was gone. Flour browned in grease, then plain water whisked in, salt and black pepper doing all the heavy lifting. It came out thinner and darker than milk gravy, and everyone at the table knew what it meant, though nobody said it. It went over biscuits, over bread, over rice, and it turned dry starch into a hot meal that a person could actually finish and feel finished. Mountain families and sharecropper families knew it by heart. Some called it pordu. Some called it nothing at all because naming it made it real. And here is the strange part. Ask the old folks now, and half of them will tell you they still like it better than the milk kind. Hardship has a flavor, and sometimes the memory of it turns sweet. Rabbit stew came from the fields instead of the store, back when the woods behind the house were part of the pantry. A boy with a box trap or a father with a shotgun could bring home supper that cost only time and shells. The rabbit got dressed at the back step, soaked overnight and stewed slow with potatoes, carrots if there were any, onions, and a thick flour and water gravy that turned the pot into something that could feed everyone regardless of how small the rabbit had been. During the leanest years, wild game was the difference between meat once a week and meat almost never. Children learned to check traps before school. Nothing about it felt like sport. It felt like chores and like pride, and like the family taking care of itself with its own hands. Bean cakes were the last act of the week's pot of beans, and maybe the best one. When the soup beans had been eaten down to a thick mash at the bottom of the pot, that mash did not get scraped into the slop bucket. It got mixed with a little flour or cornmeal, maybe an egg, shaped into patties and fried in the same skillet as everything else until each one wore a crisp brown shell. What had been Monday's soup and Wednesday's side became Friday's supper, brand new. Served with chopped raw onion on top and cornbread on the side. They were so good that some families made extra beans on purpose, just to be sure of the cakes at the end. That was the quiet miracle of those kitchens. The same cheap bag of beans, cooked once, fed a family 3 different ways, and the last way tasted like a reward. The people who cooked like that were not just surviving. They were paying attention all week long to what everything could still become. And when the plates were empty and the skillet was wiped out and hung back on its nail, the house went to sleep fed, which was the only success that ever really counted.